Hey guys, this is Fady from Heartbeat Productions and welcome to another video. I'm actually really excited about this video. Quite a bit ago I made a video about walking through the drum setup in the live room, and I walked through how we mic'd it, what mics did we use, just the full setup, but we did not talk through, we didn't show any samples, and several of you reached out saying, hey, we would like to hear what these drums sound like, and after all the miking and explaining all the pre's and all the features, what would it sound like now after it's being tracked? So I kind of put that on the back burner, and that is my bad, but eventually I got back to it, and here we go. I have a specific session in here from that live tracking setup of the drums, and we're going to go through the session. I'm going to show you guys the mics, the blend between the mics, the samples of everything I've done, as well as a whole bunch of tips and tricks of what I did and how I did it and how I get it to sound the way that I want it to sound. So let's just gonna dig in and let's go through it. And as I'm going through every channel, I'll explain what mic did I use for that channel, which pre's did I use, what analog processing I did, as well as you'll see some of the plugins that I'm using and what digital plugin in the DAW that I am using. All right, so let's kind of dig in. So here's the drum session, and then we got a whole bunch of drum loops in here. And shout out to Richard, my friend, who played the drums on this track. So this was using the CNC drum kit, and then we used a DW 8x14 collector series snare, and we used heartbeat cymbals. I believe we had a 22, a 19, and then we used the Epic hats from Heartbeat as well, which I believe are 15 inches. Okay, so let's just go first through what channels do we have. So you guys can see here in my Pro Tools session, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. So these are the mics that we used for that session. So we have a kick-in mic, which I used the D6 by Audix, and then kick out, I actually used the ML1 by Slate, and then snare top I used 57, snare bottom used 57, good old 57, and then I believe I used the ML2 by Slate, the little shotgun one for the hats, and then for the toms I actually used the Lauten Audio, the 208, for both toms. They're condenser mics, but they have good side rejection, so get less cymbal bleed. And I personally prefer condenser mics on toms versus dynamics because they don't choke the toms. For overheads, I use the KM184s by Neumann stereo pair, which I absolutely love. Then for overhead mono, which is like dead center above the drums, I used U89. And then I used Room stereo ribbons by the Fatheads, which are about 6 feet away from the drums-ish, 6 to 8 feet away from the drums. And then I used, and this was stereo, I used 2 of them in XY. And then I used a stereo room far mic, which I have my live room, and then I have another room next to it, which is kind of like the lounge area in the studio. In this one, I don't have panels in it, so there's some echo and verb in it, which I kind of like for that kind of stuff. So I set up a stereo mic over there to capture that far distant drum tone. And for this one, I used the Sphere L22, and I used it in the 180 degree, which is the stereo mode. And then last but not least, I used the Neumann U67, and I call it a knee mic, which is about a foot back behind the kick, but it sits up high and it points at the snare, which is kind of more like it captures a mono close-up feel of that kit. And my goal from that specific mic is kind of getting more kick and snare. Well, we'll go through every single mic and kind of analyze it and solo it. Before that, let's just listen to the drum kit and let's see what it sounds like. So here's like a simple loop. Let's grab something that has some toms in it so we get a feel of the toms as well. So I love it. If you have any comments on how it sounds, please let me know. We were going for really big, fat rock drums. This is kind of what we want it to do, and that's kind of the tone that is in here. We went with a really deep, fat snare, so we used the 8x14, but it's also how we tuned it, as well as those two toms. We tuned them low. It's from the CNC kit. We tuned them low so that way you can get that bottom deep end feel out of it, as well as for the kick as well. And then we want it to go with big, more wide kind of tone versus like dry, intimate. So I'm using more, that's why I'm using a lot more room mics to get that roomy drum feel for a live performance. And then I'm adding a little bit of verbs, and we'll kind of walk through them here in just a second. One thing to mention before we start, when you use a lot of room mics, I mean, it could be amazing, and it could also be an absolute disaster when it comes to phase. So there's a couple things to test for, and we'll show it here in just a second. But you got to watch for the phase specifically. You'll end up the more mics you're using, and then your phase is improper or flipped in some of these mics, is going to keep phasing out some of your drum tones, specifically the snare where you notice it the most, and then you'll end up losing tons of that snare bottom end in your mix. And you feel like, oh, I got more mics, it's going to sound bigger, but it ends up sounding smaller and not bigger. Okay, let's go through each mic. Let's solo it really quick. And I am going to go ahead and turn off everything I have right now, because I want to show you guys these mics completely dry without anything. I'm turning even the parallel processing that I'm using and the verbs. So this is like, everything is completely off right now. So let's start with the kick in. So this is a D6, which I absolutely love the D6 for kick in mics. They have like such a scooped curve, so I don't have to do much. They have, the mids are gone. They have more boosted bottom end and more boosted top end for like the punch, which is really what you want from the kick anyways. This is what it sounds like. So right off the bat, that's like a really great tone to start with. Now, what I did for that kick, I had it going through my 1073 from Vintech Audio, and then I had a bit more on the gain to get more saturation or more kind of the grid of the 1073, and then I used the EQ on that, and I boosted about 60 at around 60 hertz, and I boosted maybe 2 to 3 dB, and I also had that kick running through my 1176 compressor, and that kind of really gives that punch for that kick. So this is all the analog processing that I did for that kick. The rest of the processing is in the box. For the kick out, we use the ML1. So I'm gonna, this is obviously with the ML1, you kind of need to use the plugin, but I'm gonna show you guys before the plugin. And by the way, I recorded the kick out through my 1073. So still ran through the 1073. Same, the Heritage Audio one. I'm sorry, the Vintech Audio one. And normally my goal with a kick out is for me, and different people do it different, but because I have a lot of room mics already, I'm using the kick out mostly to get a sub kick, because I don't have an actual sub kick, so I'm using the kick out to make it a sub kick. And in this case, I chose the 47, and then I chose the 1073. You can feel that boomy low end, which we'll see here in just a second when I add the EQs and everything, what I'm kind of going for tone-wise for this. All right, for snare, I used the 57 into my 1073. Now the snare had a bit more processing because the snare is kind of, it needs a lot more work. So the snare top mic, it ran through the Pultec EQ, and I kind of cranked a lot of the bottom end, about 60 hertz, and then I boosted maybe up to 5 or 6, and then I grabbed about 5K, and I boosted another 5 or 6 to get that crisped top end from the snare. And then I also ran the snare through my API compressor, and I used it on the new versus the old to get more of an aggressive 1176 kind of compression, and about 4:1 ratio, and I'm kind of compressing maybe about 3 dB ish, around that. And then after my API, I also ran the snare through my Neve 542, which is the tape and Neve saturation, and I ran it on the silk red, and then I ran it on the I believe I did the 15 tape, not the 30 IPS, because the 15 has a bit more bottom end, and that's kind of what I was going for. And in that same exact chain is what I used for the snare bottom. So this one, so the snare bottom, because I only had one Pultec, so it didn't go through Pultec, but it went through the right side of it went through the 1073 into the right side of the API into the tape saturation from the Neve. So let's kind of listen to the snare without anything at all. So this is snare top, completely raw. So that's already, like, I really like this. And I worked with Richard a little bit about mic placement, how close we are and how far. I wanted to get that bottom end, but I didn't want a lot of the ring from the snare. So we kind of messed with it a little bit until we kind of got it where it sits, which I love how it sits. Now kind of layering that with the snare bottom, and I had to flip the phase on the snare bottom. We'll talk about phase after I go through all the mics. So the snare bottom mic, and I've learned that from a friend of mine, you want to run your snare wires, you want to run the bottom mic along the snare wires. So if the wires are like this, you want to run the bottom mic like this. You don't want to run it like this. So the way I do it, I always let the drummer set up his snare where the wires are looking away from the kick. And then that way I can set up the mic looking away from the kick, and I get the least, as much as I can, least kick bleed into my bottom snare. So here's I'm just going to solo the snare bottom. In this, because we tuned that snare loose, and that's what we wanted, you're going to hear like a lot of wires coming. It feels kind of too loose in a way for the snare bottom mic. Which I really like where it sits. Now hats, this is pretty straightforward. I know there are techniques miking the hats from the bottom or miking it from the top. For this one, I mic'd it from the top, but what I do is I do almost like a 45-degree angle facing away from the kit. So that way I can get less snare-ish in that. Let's pick a beat that actually have like a closed hat. Yeah, here you go. And because I used ML2, I ended up choosing that one mic in there and still ran a 1073. So that's for the hat, straightforward. Now for the toms, let's grab a tom beat. Here you go. So for the toms, I used the 208, but the difference, so I'm still running through the 1073 for the toms, but then I also ran the toms through, I have the West Audio Pultec EQ, so I ran it through that, and that gave me a stereo EQ. I ran it in dual mono, one for the rack tom, one for the floor tom. And then I went into the Summit Audio dual compressor, and that's a tube compressor. And then I ran it in dual mono as well, one for tom 1, for tom 2, about the same 4:1 ratio, and about 2, maybe 3 dB at tops for compression for that one. And then here is tom 1. And then here's tom 2. Now together, here's just raw tom mics. and you can feel that boominess in the tom 2 specifically, and we kind of wanted this because we wanted, when you hit that floor tom, you almost feel like another kick because you get that boomy sustained low note, and we tuned it to kind of get that way. And just a side note, if whatever tone you're going for, try to do it from the drum tuning, not in post. And instead of try to listen to it as an engineer in this room, what I have to do is I had the drummer tune, and I went out there and I had him play it, and I'm standing right there next to it and listening it. And then I would determine first, this is the tone that I want. Then after that, which mic I would use to capture that, and then which pre I would use, and then the placement for the mic and the settings on the pre's or the analog processing. All right, going to overheads. So for overheads, I use the KM184s, which are really bright. They're just, that's how they are, which I kind of like it for the overheads, because that's what I'm going. I want those crisp, bright cymbals. And then I ran it through my SSL Fusion, and I actually used my the Warm Audio, the 412 pre's for that one instead of the 1073, because I did not want any more grid on that mic. I wanted more kind of clean gain. And I ran it through my Fusion, which on the Fusion, I did not use the drive. I actually only used the Violet EQ, the high frequency compressor, and the stereo imager, just the hair wider and the SSL transformer. And then I also ran it through my Dione, which is the West Audio stereo bus compressor, which is like their clone of the G bus by SSL. And that was it in terms of processing wise for the overheads. Which is super clean tone, captures everything. Absolutely love what it sounded. Let's gonna grab a section where there was like a ride or cymbals, so that way you can get a feel of it. Here you go. And then overhead mono is the U89, and that ran through the 1073 mic pre. Let's pick that same beat that we were doing. There you go. And that one, so if I had, for example, my stereo overhead mics, they were maybe a couple feet above the cymbals on both sides, and then I measured the distance to the snare and made sure that they're equal to the snare. Then the mono overhead is above the drummer's head, and it was about 9 foot off the ground, because my ceiling is about 10-foot ceiling, so I had it maybe 1 foot off the ceiling, and it's looking down from behind the drummer with like a slight angle and looking at the snare. And here's how it sounds like. It's interesting because it's much darker than the overhead mics. I'm going to go back and forth here. Next mic over is the Ribbon, which is the fathead mics, which I ran those through my WA412. And then I ran them in XY about maybe 6 feet away from the drum kit. And they're very well known for like their MIDI tone, super MIDI, very fat tone. That's from their name. So it's kind of what they sound like. And I believe I did not do any processing for those, like analog processing. This was just straight into my 412s and then into my interface. Okay, and then the next is Room Far. So I would say it's almost one of my favorites. So like I've explained, this was in the other room, and then I used the Sphere 180, and then here's the plugin. I'm gonna turn it on. So I used the 47, and then I ran it in cardioid pattern, and you could do omni or cardioid on that one. I kind of cut some up to about to 100, and then I kind of pulled the width a little bit wider because I wanted that really far wide room mic. And then this is what that one sounds like. Let's make sure it's turned up. And if we go to Omni, it'll actually sound significantly different. Here you go. The Omni kind of makes it more in the mono range, less wide, and then the cardioid makes it much, much wider because it's left and right are different now, more different. I kind of like the cardioid for that specific purpose. Then the last is the U67, which ran to my 610 pre, and it's about 1 foot in front of the kick, and it's tall enough. It sits a little bit taller than the kick, maybe 4 or 5 feet off the ground, and it's pointing at the snare. That's what it sounds like. And again, the idea is when we're using so many room mics is for each one of these room mics serves a specific purpose, and I'm trying to get specific tone out of it. Okay, let's talk about phase here really quick. So some of the phase I aligned while I was in the process of recording, and then some of the phase I actually did in post. And a really simple, easy way to kind of figure out the phase would be, so let me go back to channel here. So let's just pick the room, because I know that these were out of phase and I had to flip the phase on them. And then let's just add time adjuster so we kind of see this. I'm going to put this at the very top. I'm going to use this as like a Pro Tool plugin that works kind of like as a trimmer. What I'm doing is I'm just going to flip the phase on it. And then bypassed, it means phase is not flipped, and when I activate it, it flips the phase. And then here's what you want to do. You want to solo your snare top, and then you want to solo that mic that we're testing. And let's kind of find a section where it has like a solid snare beat. Here you go. Now I'm just going to loop that snare. And then what I'm going to do is there's 2 ways to test it. One is start to gradually pull that mic up and watch if the bottom end of the snare is changing, where it's disappearing or not. Or the other option is level both mics and then flip the phase back and forth on the room mic and then see how the bottom end of the snare is being affected. So we'll do the second technique right now. So I got both mics are soloed, and then I have this over here bypassed. So I can already tell, and obviously make sure that you're listening with some nice headphones or speakers. If you're listening on your phone or a laptop speaker, you won't be able to tell the difference. When I activate this, when it's active, which means I flip the phase, what's happening is now the bottom end of the snare is feeling a little bit more present. When I turn it off, because they are slightly out of phase, the bottom end kind of scoops out a little bit. And then just kind of follow the same principle for all of the rest of the mics, and that's kind of how I phase align it. Then you can also grab the file and manually move it to line up the phase. Okay, so let's go now to each mic and what processing we ended up doing for that mic. All right, so I'm gonna try to go through this quick so it doesn't take forever. So kick in, so here's my kick in mic, which, let me pick up a beat here. Let's just pick that same beat that we were playing. So for that one, basically I have a simple EQ to cut some of that low end, some of the mid range, sorry, just a little bit. It's not like crazy. And then I have my Pultec EQ boosting about 60 a little bit and about 8K. Then I have my SSL, which I'm boosting a little bit more of the highs on the SSL and then cutting some of the 300. Then I have saturation from the satin. And then I have just a hair of compression from here. So kind of all of them together. In here, it's more punchy, cuts through a bit more. And then I also have parallel processing. So I'm running through a parallel drum bus that on it I have my API compressing really hard with such a fast attack, lots of compression. Then I'm using the radiator from Sound Toys, as well as the decapitator for more saturation and drive, and also the vintage drive. So I'm like pushing it hard on that one. So here is when I added the parallel processing. And then the last is I like to do a little bit of room mics on like room verbs, I'm sorry, on the kick, so that way it's not too dry. All right, now for kick out, I obviously have the ML1 simulation plugin, and then you can see that EQ is too drastic, but I really don't want any of the highs. This is really, for me, it's a sub kick. So I'm cutting all my highs, using it as a sub kick, and then running my SSL again for a little bit of, I actually don't need to do this, boosting about 40 Hertz, and then a little bit of gate, just a hair. And then still running saturation and running my 1176, the same. Okay, now if I, I don't have any parallel processing on that one, kind of layer both, and I'm gonna turn that kick out mic up and down to kind of show you guys what it feels like. And I do need to adjust that gate a little bit because I'm hearing the clipping of the gate opening and closing. But you get the idea. And the more I turn that mic up, the more boomy, subby, not boomy, more subby the kick is, which depending on the style of music I'm going for, and the more punchy and less subby that kick is. Okay, snare top. And I know like snare is like the nightmare of all engineers. So what I have is a really simple EQ, cutting a little bit here, and then just dynamic EQ about 6K. And then I have another layer of pull tech. This time I'm not pushing it hard because I actually used the analog pull tech for this and I pushed it hard. So I'm pushing about 60 and then about 8K, and I'm cutting a little bit about 10K. And then after that, I have my SSL, same thing, using the gate from that, boosting a little bit about 7K, boosting a little bit about 2K. And I'm also using the compressor from that one, just super gentle, maybe like, yeah, here you go. It's like barely even touching a 3 dB reduction. And then I'm using saturation from the Saturn as well. And you guys seeing I'm using this a lot because I love that saturation plugin. I love the versatility. I love like I have tones in here and then band presence and all that stuff. And then I'm using 1176 again, just a hair. You can see that. And then I'm using a transient shaper from Isotope, which I love their version more than other companies because I can split frequencies and choose what I want to do. And really what I'm doing is that bottom frequency, the low end, which is up to, I set it to 280. And I'm actually increasing the attack on this. I want to more snap up there because I was going for that thumb kind of blow of air on the snare on the bottom end. And then after that is my parallel processing. So going through the same parallel bus. Yeah, here we go. Now you can hear the parallel compression with long sustain and a lot more punch to the snare. And then it's just a bunch of verbs, which I'm using room, reverb, which my rooms are, I'm using the 480, the LX 480 from Relap. I'm using that actually for my room, my short plate, my hall, and my long plate. I just love that verb. And then I'm using gated verb from Valhalla Vintage Verb. That's all of it. Then for the snare bottom is not much difference. So I'm using similar EQ, Pultec EQ as well. Same with the just less EQ happening in here, kind of more using it for the gate. And then saturation from the Saturn. Then this time I'm using the API compressor versus the 1176 compressor. Then same thing, verbs, parallel processing, a little bit of parallel processing, and then more gated verb on the bottom snare. I like the bottom snare with the gated verb. Okay, so now we got this, let's kind of combine both snares together. And you guys can tell I gated the bottom snare more than the top snare. I don't like to choke the top snare. That's for those. Hi-hat, really not a lot happening because I'm using that mic, the ML2, and then I just put an EQ, and you can see I just got rid of everything all the way to 1K. And then I just added a dynamic EQ in here to soften the hi-hats a little bit. Yeah, just a little dynamic EQ in here. And then I added the soothe, and same thing. Now the hats are less harsh. And then just adding a little bit of room and short plate, long plate, just is really subtle. All right, going to toms, which are my least favorite to mix. So you can see I have a lot of EQ going on. I had a ring in here, and I had to clean up some of the mids and then get rid of a little bit of that slap on the tom up here at 5K. And then I'm using same thing, the EQ or the channel strip from here, and I'm using the gate from there, a little bit of compression, cutting a lot around 800, and then boosting a little bit about 6K. And then I'm boosting a little bit about 93. And then saturation, same thing, a little bit of API compression. And then I added more saturation using the vintage drive, but running it in parallel. And then at the end, I added some Pultec EQ because I was missing a little bit of the 60 Hertz. And then I was actually adding a little bit of 5K, but cutting some of that 10K. So that's kind of where the tom is. So it sounds cleaner, more tight, and I'm not as much of that ringy tone in it. Still doing parallel processing and then some verbs on it. Okay, going to the floor tom. You'll see I have a little bit less EQ. It wasn't as much needed. And then same thing with this SSL. I'm boosting about 6K a little bit. Then I'm cutting about 800, but this one I'm cutting more. I'm cutting like 12.5 dB. And then boosting a little bit, but I went lower down to 50 because I wanted that subby kind of tone out of that tom. And then same saturation, API 2500. And again, all of these things are super subtle. Like I don't run something where it compresses a lot or does a lot. It's just super subtle. Feels like I have a lot of plugins, but each one does something very small. Vintage drive, Pultec EQ, kind of same thing. And then parallel processing and verbs. All right, going to overheads. So I have an EQ in the overhead where I got rid of anything below 100. I really didn't need it. I have it in all my other room mics. And then I put a gentle API compressor, a gentle stereo widening from the SSL Fusion. And then I put the Bloom plugin, which I really like it. And then, because I did not want a lot of that bottom end from those overheads. Now for overhead mono, I had to do more work to it. So I had a simple EQ, but then I have the decapitator because I wanted to add, and you guys can see I'm pushing it hard. I want that gritty, dirty tone out of that one. And I'm kind of trying to create more distinction between the overhead and the mono overhead. Then I also have my SSL. I also have my Pultec. I have my vintage drive. I have my 500, and then I have another layer of EQ, which I had just a couple frequencies I wanted to get rid of. So here's kind of at the end of it. You can see it's compressed harder. I'm compressing it more. I barely compress the overheads, and I'm hearing a lot of saturation and drive coming from the Saturn as well as from the decapitator. Okay, then next is the ribbon mics. Again, doing EQ, saturation or drive from the decapitator. And then this one I use this SSL bus comp on it. Then I use the radiator as well. And the room mics, I don't like to run them into parallel compression. So, and that's why I'm adding these things to it to get some of the tone I would have done if I ran them into my parallel process. So my parallel bus process is mostly for my kick, snare, and toms. Then got my Pultec EQ, vintage drive, API, a little bit of stereo widening, and then another layer of EQ cutting about the same frequency that was bothering me in the other one. And then I'm going to put a little bit of a room verb on. Okay, room far. I already have my sphere, and then you can see my EQ. I don't have anything on it. Actually, I think the only thing nothing. And then my saturation, decapitator, a little bit of Pultec, a little bit of stereo widening, and then same frequency that I was trying to cut out. And then last 67, we got some EQ on it, saturation, decapitator as well, Pultec. This one I used 1176 for it, and then another layer of EQ. Now, I don't have anything on a drum bus yet, but let's kind of play that section, and I'm just going to need to level some layers here. Okay, now that kind of averagely leveled my drum bus, I have SSL bus comp, but you can see like 1 dB, maybe. I have a vintage drive. I have that EQ cutting a little bit from the side, and then I'm cutting here just a hair. Then I have a Pultec EQ that is doing like 1 at 10K, just a little bit of air, and then a little bit at 30. API, I'm using the UA version for that one, just a hair of compression, and I'm using the tape from UA, and then I'm using the Bloom plugin, and then a little bit of stereo widening, and then a hair of Soothe. So now that the whole thing is running together, so really what that did is clean some of the low mids, added a hair more sub tone to it, and then just a bit more crisp so the drums cut through. It looks like I have 9 plugins, but it's still a really subtle change for each one. And then my verbs, as I've explained, I'm using the Lexicon ones, the 480 from Relap, and I'm using this for my hall, short plate, drum room, long plate, and then I'm using a gated verb from Valhalla. And then I have this, I normally don't use it, depending on the tone, but I'm not using it. It's like a cathedral kind of verb, like super far out. If I'm mixing a record, I want to make it like a live mix. That's kind of what I would use that one. But right now I don't even have it routed to anything. This is a full breakdown of my drum setup, just basic how I got it. Now, obviously, a lot of these EQs, compression, all that stuff will change when these drums are inside a session and I'm mixing that drums and according to what tone we were going for, according to what color, and are we going for more tighter drums or are we going for more verbed out, live concert kind of feel drums. But anyways, this is kind of the breakdown of it. I hope this was helpful for you guys. If you have any question, please reach out. Don't hesitate. Also, if you need any drum tracking for any of your projects, let us know, and then we can track these here and send you the files. Just shoot me an email. My email is in the description below, and I'll be happy to do that for you guys. And make sure to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.